are now on page 68 and 15. And we're going to do exercises 1 through 3 together. So, the directions say, use the coordinate plane below to answer parts A through C. So letter A says, graph at least 5 points on the x-axis and label their coordinates. So if we look at the coordinate plane, which axis is the x-axis? Take about 10 seconds and label the x-axis. Very good. So if you label the axis that runs horizontally from left to right as the x-axis, you are correct. And the axis that goes vertically up and down is the y-axis. So now that we have identified our axes, we are now going to graph at least 5 points on the x-axis. So I'm going to do 1 for an example, and then you will do the other 4. So if I look at the x-axis, I need to graph a point on this axis and then label it. And it could be anywhere on this x-axis. It just has to be a point. So I am going to graph my point right here. This is my first point. And I'm going to label the coordinate for that point. You can see that's my point. And I'm going to say that my coordinate, I'm not going to say it, my coordinate actually is, if I start here at the origin, and so remember, a coordinate has a point has an x coordinate and a y coordinate. So x always comes first, so I start at the origin, and I'm going to go 3 units to the right. So 1, 2, 3. So my x coordinate is going to be 3. And because I didn't move up or down on the y-axis, I didn't go in any direction or either direction, there's no movement, so it's going to be 0. So my first coordinate is 3, 0. So now it's your turn to graph 5 points on the x-axis, label their coordinates, and then write the points over here. Take about 1 minute. And you can pause this video and come back when you have grabbed your 5 points. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you have graphed your 5 points, and we are going to move on. But first, before we move on, did anyone, or did you, graph a point that had a coordinate that was a rational number? So a coordinate that wasn't a whole number. Please keep in mind that all points on a coordinate plane are not whole numbers. You can have points on your coordinate plane that are rational numbers. I'm going to show you. So if I get closer, I'm going to start here at the origin. And let's say I want a point, sorry, let me back up a little bit. Okay, right here. It's a little messy, but to that point is right. If we start at the origin, let's see where it is. 1, 2, 3. So right in the middle of -3 and 4. So my x coordinate would be, if it's in the middle of -3 and 4, -3.5.
Malone.
Yes.
One of these.
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Everybody trying to be so good. I didn't know.
So now that you all have your 5 points, I only have 2, but you should have 5, and they should have fallen on the x-axis. So now I want you to tell me, looking at letter B, what do the coordinates of your points have in common? So you should have 5 of these. And looking at your points, what do they have in common? What do they have in common? Take a moment to think about it. You got Okay, so I'm just going to assume to add 5 points or 3 more points just so that I can have 5 like you. I'm gonna do this one. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's negative 9, 0. I'm gonna do here, and that's going to be positive 9, 0. And then I'm going to do one more. I'll do that one right here. And that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 0. So I have my 5 points. I'm going to put them over here. So I had negative 9, 0. I had 7, 0. And I also have 9, no, not 9. Yeah, 9, 0. So the question again is, what do the coordinates of your points have in common? So if we look at our points, and keep in mind your points might be different from mine, that's okay, as long as all of our points fall on the x-axis, they fall or lie on the x-axis. So if I look at my points, and hopefully you've already answered the question, what these points have in common, I would say that I notice that all of my points have a what? 0 as which coordinate? 0 as the y coordinate. So all the coordinates or points have 0 as the y coordinate. Now, that is what they have in common. So if you didn't have this, go ahead and make some revisions. And if you had it, great job. If not, great job as well. Just make some revisions. So all the coordinates have a 0 as the y coordinate. Y coordinate 0, y coordinate 0, y coordinate 0, y coordinate 0, y coordinate 0. So all of the points that lie on my x-axis have a y coordinate 0. So let's look at C, and I'm going to ask you, what must be true about any point that lies on the x-axis? Explain. What must be true about any point that lies on the x-axis? Take about 30 seconds to respond in writing. Pause the video. Go. Okay, so hopefully you have came up with your answer, and let's talk about it. So what must be true about any point that lies on the x-axis? So if a point lies on the x-axis, its y coordinate must be 0. And we see that. So if it lies on the x-axis, the y coordinate must be 0, because the point is located 0 units above or 0 units below the x-axis. So we notice when it lies on the x-axis, there are no units above the x-axis and there are no units below the x-axis. So that is why if a point lies on the x-axis, the y coordinate must be 0. So go ahead and jot that down or make any revisions if you didn't have that. So if a coordinate, or if a point lies on the x-axis, the y coordinate must, and I'm going to put that in all caps to emphasize, must be 0. Now, if I'm going too slowly, please feel free to speed it along. If I'm going too fast, please feel free to slow it down and pause. So here's what you're going to do. So now that we have completed exercise 1 together, you are going to complete exercise 2, A, B, and C. using the same process that we used to complete exercise 1. You have about 2 minutes and go. This is the end of this video. You'll pick up on part 2. Alright, so at this time you all should have completed exercise 2, but I wanted to go back to exercise 1 and clear up a mistake I made. So you have to be very, very careful and precise when you are counting the units on the coordinate plane, because if you make one mistake, because it's easy to make a mistake and put down the wrong coordinate. So earlier I had -9 and 9. As you can see the white out, I had to fix it, but it was because I counted wrong. So you have to be very careful when you're counting the units to get to certain points. Okay, so I corrected that, and I also corrected it on my coordinate plane. So it's okay if you make a mistake, but that's why it's always important to go back and double check your work like I did here and saw that I made a mistake. I also added to my explanation. Sometimes we go back and we revise. I went back and added to my explanation for letter C. So I'm gonna show you exercise 2, and you can make any revisions, but the thing I want to point out is our points might be different. Again, there are an infinite amount of points that can lie on this coordinate plane on the x-axis and on the y-axis, so yours may be different from mine. But one thing that we should have been able to draw the same conclusion in letters B and C. So what do the coordinates of your points have in common? So if you look at your coordinates, if you look at my coordinates, your partner's coordinates, if you guys did this correctly and labeled your points on the y-axis, all the coordinates should have 0 as the x-coordinate. Here's x-coordinate is 0, x-coordinate 0, x-coordinate 0, x-coordinate 0, x-coordinate 0. So all of your points should have an x-coordinate of 0. And so what that means, what must be true about any point that lies on the y-axis, so any point that lies on the y-axis must have an x-coordinate that is 0. Any point that lies on the y-axis must have an x-coordinate that is 0. And this is because the point is 0 units to the left, or it's 0 units to the left or right of the y-axis. So that what it means by 0 units is that means we go 0 units to the left and we go 0 units to the right, which makes us stay on the y-axis. Okay, so last one in this exercise, number 3. If the origin is the only point with 0 for both coordinates, what must be true about the origin? So this is the origin. This is how we label the origin. It's 0, 0. So if the origin is the only point with 0 for both coordinates, what can we say about the origin? Take a moment to think about it. So hopefully you came up with something like this. So the origin, sorry, I'm trying to write. The origin is the only.
Did she want the kids to come in when they arrive? Okay.
The origin, that was Mr. Watts. The origin is the only point that lies both on the x-axis and the y-axis. So the origin is the only point that lies on the x-axis and the y-axis. Okay, so we have completed exercise 3. So now what I want you guys. All right, so now we are ready for exercise 4 on page S.16. So it says locate each point described by the ordered pairs below. Locate and label each point described by the ordered pairs below. Indicate lies in. So I'm going to do letter A with you together, and then you're going to do B, C, D, and E independently. B, C, D, and E independently. And we're going to do A together. So it says locate and label each point. So locate and label means this is my point. I know that 7 is my x-coordinate. go and I'm going to start at the origin. And the more practice you have with it, you don't have to start at the origin. That way it's just look at the coordinate plane and automatically go to the origin. But if you're learning, we're going to start at the origin. We're going to go 7 units. It's positive 7, so we're going to go 7 units and 2 units up. So if I start at the origin, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units. I'll stop here because we haven't gotten to our destination. So 7 units to the right, and then 1, 2 units above, or 3 units up. And then is the 2. And if I look at my point, and it says indicate which of the quadrants the points lie in. Well, remember from earlier, this is quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. So if you wanted to go ahead and sort of label it, you can. Or at this point, you should have it labeled here. I hadn't done it yet, but you should have labeled here. If not, you can go back to page S.67. So anyway, so this point, 7-2, is located, or it lies in quadrant 1. I want you to write quadrant.
Just once you just come in here and sit.
Okay. The Roman numeral. Okay. So that's what you're going to do. You need to do B, C, D, and E.
Okay.
And I'm not going to
gotcha.
put the answers on video. You just put your answers here.
You can go into
Label-
the
you can label your points
the
here,
staff
and
one.
then at some point, a teacher will come around and check your work. Do these independently, and then you can check your work. Go. All right, guys, now we are ready to move on to exercise 5. And the directions for exercise 5 say write the coordinates of at least one other point in each of the 4 quadrants. Now, I'm going to push you all, instead of doing 1 point for each quadrant, I want you to do 3 points for each quadrant. So go ahead and scratch out 1 and put 3. Now, you can do more than 3 if you want, but I want you to do 3. So let's look at letter A. So if we look at quadrant 1, if we remember, go back to our coordinate plane. Quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So the points that you choose for quadrant 1 must lie on the inside of quadrant 1. Okay? Now, let's start with choosing a point. So I'm going to go start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 3 units to the right, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 units up. So my point is going to be 3, 4, okay? Now, you need to choose your own point, your own 3 points, and put them here. So for quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So go ahead and pause the video and write the coordinates for of at least 3 points in each of the 4 quadrants. Okay, so now we're back, and you all should have at least 3 points for each quadrant. And remember, we all may have different points because there is an infinite amount of points that we can choose, or an infinite amount of coordinates that we can choose. So yours may be different. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some points here. So there's 3 for here. Quadrant 2. Okay, quadrant 3. Okay, and then the last quadrant. Okay, so I've identified 3 point or 3 coordinates in each quadrant. So now this is really key, this question here. So what I want you to do is look at your points that you put for each quadrant and tell me, do you see any similarities in the points within each quadrant? Explain your reasoning. So if I look at quadrant A, what's similar about each of our coordinates? Quadrant 2, what's similar about each of our coordinates? 3, what's similar? And 4, what's similar? So if I looked at quadrant 1, I see that each coordinate in quadrant 1, or both the x coordinate and the y coordinate, is going to be positive. So that means in quadrant 1, the x coordinate is positive and the y coordinate is positive. So what I'm going to write is my first point in quadrant 1, both the x and y coordinates are positive. So what that tells me is no matter what point we pull from quadrant 1, both the x coordinate and the y coordinate is going to be positive. So now it's your turn. What do you notice about the points in quadrant B, quadrant C, and quadrant D? Go ahead and finish this up, and then your teacher will be around to ask any clarifying questions and tell you what to do next.